And we sometimes think that being hard on ourselves and beating up on ourselves and driving ourselves is the way to get ourselves to be better. And what that really means is that it's actually much more painful and harder to look honestly at ourselves because we're so awful to ourselves in the process. So there can be this mistaken belief that the harder we are on ourselves, the more we succeed, the better we get. And it is absolutely false. And it's a compelling but mistaken idea about how high achievers experience sustained excellence. And it just simply isn't that way. The way that we achieve sustained excellence is by meeting ourselves where we are with friendliness, with encouragement, with compassion, with acceptance, and then asking ourselves to grow and doing it in a way that it's much more effective and much more sustainable when we can take that approach to how we see ourselves and talk to ourselves.
Flute brilliance on the big stage, leading the charge for gender equality, mentoring the next wave of musicians. Our guest today, she's aced all of this and more. Stay tuned to Deep Dive, coming right up on the Honesty Pill podcast. All right, everybody, welcome to episode 38 of the Honesty Pill podcast. We are here to help you with all things music, whether it's getting better at practicing, performing. Of course, we talk a lot about auditions in here. We also talk about starting your own music or non-music related business. So we're going to get the behind the scenes into what goes on in the practice room, auditions, and even the business side of things. Our guest today is walking the walk in the biggest possible way. I can't wait for you to hear more of her story. But first, a quick shout out to the sponsor of this podcast, the Yamaha Corporation of America. Stay tuned for more on them later. And we are live streaming this episode, so go ahead and drop your questions in the chat. And please subscribe to this channel and hit that little bell so you don't miss a thing going on over here at Honesty Pill Mission Control. All right, let's get into it. Flutist, advocate, mentor, I am truly honored to welcome someone who's not only distinguished herself as the principal flute of the Boston Symphony since 2004, but also champions women's rights, gender equality, and mentors musicians all over the world. Welcome to the podcast, Elizabeth Rowe.
Thank you so much for having me on. I can't wait. And I think this is my first ever live stream video experience. So we're off and running. I love it.
No net. This is the real deal. So there's no editing.
Yeah.
By the way, I should say welcome back to the podcast, Elizabeth, because you are the first person, the first guest in the history of my show to be returning for the second time. So that's going to be really fun. By the way, here we are on Halloween and I forgot to wear my costume. Do you have any plans later or are you just going to hang out?
You know, I have a puppy. His name is Chester, and I'm waiting to see if he turns into like a weredoodle or something like that. If there's something crazy that happens in the, but no, the short answer is no big Halloween plans. What about you?
Well, we're on a weird street that nobody comes to, but we're going to go trick or treating down where all the people get really into it. So it should be fun. Our kids are still at an age where they're kind of into it. So let's start off with some really hard hitting questions. Candy corns. Disgusting or totally disgusting?
Listen, I have a problem with candy corn because if I purchase it, I eat the entire quantity, whatever it is, and then I'm like horribly sick from it. And so I absolutely love it, and it cannot enter my home. It cannot enter my home either because I think it is one of the most disgusting substances. As comedian Lewis Black put it, he said, all of the candy corn that was ever created was created in 1950, and they just keep collecting it out of the garbage and putting it back in the bags. It's so gross. It's aging beautifully. It's a delicacy. I'm pro candy corn.
All right, you heard it here. Breaking news. She's pro candy corn. Okay, actually, I do want to get into kind of a little bit of an interesting topic with you to start us off, and it has to do with this need to have a label. I find myself even now being conscious of this habit. When I meet someone new, I always feel compelled to include my title. Like, hey, I'm Chris. I'm a trumpet player. It's such a weird knee-jerk reaction. Maybe it started when we were meeting each other at festivals like Tanglewood where we met. But I feel like we're really hung up on titles in the music industry. And your identity is certainly shifting from flute player to coach, artist, advocate, which we'll get into a little bit later. But what are your thoughts on this feeling that we all need to label ourselves and maybe even paint ourselves into an identity corner?
such a huge and valuable question. And I have this conversation with so many people, a lot of musicians and a lot of people who are not musicians, who are doing something interesting and off the beaten path in their lives and struggle with how they talk about it and how they sort of coming up with that quick little elevator pitch that feels comfortable for them and feels adequate in describing really who they are. And that's part of the challenge, right? And part of the difficulty is that many of us, most of us, are, have multifaceted careers, multifaceted lives. There's a lot more to us than a title or a label. And yet, especially in social circles and in professional settings, we revert to that label and that title. And I, in fact, had a really interesting conversation with a musician recently who's a very successful performer who plays with a lot of local ensembles, teaches on a lot of conservatory faculties. And she pointed out to me that musicians often use the word a job. If you have a job, and we use that as shorthand for sort of like a big orchestra position, right? And she was saying to me, but I have a job. I have 5 or 6 jobs. And it's such an interesting observation from her that we reduce, right? We have this shorthand that really flattens and makes two-dimensional what is, very rich and nuanced. And it's, I see a lot of people struggling with this, and I think it serves all of us to have a richer, more interesting kind of conversation about who we are and what we do, and to not reduce ourselves to these labels. And it's sort of a reality of our culture, is that that's how we kind of move through the world, in that shorthand language.
And I think realistically too, it's probably not even feasible to only have one channel to express yourself as an artist. Certainly not to have be gainfully employed. There are orchestra jobs that are out there. There are teaching positions, but there's, we saw what happened with the pandemic and just what's happened to our industry in general over the past decades. It is definitely more competitive and more difficult to make what I think is a reasonable living doing it. And I've talked about this in previous podcasts too. Why would you want to do that anyway? It seems so narrow-minded given the amount of skills that we all have brought to the table anyway.
Well, I think that one of the things that's also interesting to consider too is, do we look to one place in our lives to offer us a sense of meaning and purpose and fulfillment? And if, even if we are a person who has a primary job, who has sort of one place that they tend to go to full time for most of their employment and for most of what they consider to be work, the idea that that place is the place where we can get all of the meaning, fulfillment, purpose, satisfaction that we tend to look for in that one place is often, it's not accurate. It's not often available to a lot of us. And so there's so much value in either celebrating a multifaceted career and a multifaceted professional life because of the richness that it affords us, or being realistic about when we perhaps only do have one job because it's a job that is sizable enough or occupies enough of our schedule or our brains or whatever it is, that it's the primary thing that we do, to recognize that that may actually not be enough in terms of our own fulfillment and our own satisfaction. And that can be something that catches people by surprise also, especially in the classical music industry, where until recently, until people like you are starting to talk about this, there's sometimes been a single-minded focus on kind of getting a job or one big thing. And it's often, that's not enough in all sorts of ways when we think about what enough means to people.
Let's talk about that, what enough means. Let's talk about the definition of success, because it's been taught that the big orchestra job or the, faculty position tenured is the definition of success. What do you coach your clients who are grappling with that realization that maybe that isn't enough? How do you counsel them?
Such a great question. And I think that's something that each of us has to answer for ourselves. And I think even that statement is kind of a radical statement, in the sense that many of us have bought into somebody else's idea or a prevailing definition of what success looks like. And I think that is a question for each of us to answer individually. And I am very often taking a strong stand on the idea that success has to include personal happiness. It has to include relationships. It has to include dimension in our lives, right? And so we tend to think of success as being in this kind of very narrow career space or professional space. And to me, I mean, I know, and I work with a lot of people who have a lot of success, CEOs, people who are big leaders in big corporations and who have, fat bank accounts, and, musicians who are very, very, in very prestigious, kind of highly visible positions. And when they haven't attended to the rest of their lives, there's not enough space for the rest of their lived experience to really be nurtured and paid attention to. They might look like success on the page, and their actual lived experience is far from that. And so it can be a long, slow process to figure out, how do I want to define this for myself? And do I detach myself and kind of unwind some of those preconceived beliefs that I have been walking around buying into, that I'm not even sure where they came from, and I'm not sure that I opted into those beliefs, and maybe I want to challenge them and make my own definition going forward.
Exactly. And I think if you define yourself solely by that title or that prestigious position, if something happens to that, what are you left with? Let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about the failure aspect of this. And here's a question. So you did not get into Curtis. Does rejection mean a career ruined? Looking back, you can answer that question. You can answer that question, but there is someone right now who's not getting into Curtis, who's grappling with that. Is my life over? Should I really be doing this? What would you say to them?
So I think there's so much power in recognizing that it's not the circumstance that dictates kind of our future and our path. It's how we relate to it. All right. So it's how we relate to not getting into Curtis. So if you relate to that as a definitive pronouncement about your value and your worth and your future, and if that's the orientation you have to not getting into Curtis, that is going to be your reality. You're going to create that for yourself. And if you relate to not getting into Curtis as, sure, it's going to be a big ouch in the moment. It might be a huge disappointment. It might feel like a setback. And if we can relate to that as, okay, what's the opportunity for me here? How can I find what I need, create what I need in what is available to me in these circumstances that I have? And it would have been a dream to get into Curtis. And I am so profoundly grateful that I ended up on the path that I was on, that I ended up with the teacher that I ended up with. And I think part of that was because I was really committed to getting what I needed out of the environment that I was in, and to creating my own success, or creating my own experience. And so it's really how we relate to those things that is where the power lies for us. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to start to notice how we are thinking about these experiences that we have, and these sort of what can be defining moments in our trajectory, and how we use them to serve us, or to set us back, or to hold us back.
I learned most of what I needed to learn to get a job after I graduated. And I think that probably happens for a lot of people. So putting so much weight on zeros and ones, whether this worked out or it didn't, there's a multitude of pathways to success, and kind of piggybacking on what you said of how you define that success can really open up a whole world of possibilities. So you're not pinning everything on one outcome. And also, good luck at that audition, for example, if you're putting that much pressure on yourself. There's a comment from Bryce here I wanted to share, which is, what thoughts or advice would you give a financially struggling professional flutist aspiring to find success in the orchestra audition circuit, working full-time at a job that's not flute-related is beyond frustrating when all I want to do is play the flute? So he's kind of asking, like, how do I manage the finance part and the balancing part and all those things? It's a great question, Bryce.
It is a great question. And I really acknowledge you for raising that question, because it's it's a real question, and those are real challenges that you're facing. And, everybody has to make their own choices and decide what are the trade-offs that are acceptable, right, in life. And I think part of what ends up being a difficult situation for folks is when you have lots of strong ambitions and really want to be spending a lot of time in the practice room. And then you have realistic, actual financial requirements that you are meeting. And that's a real thing. So I think, something that can be useful to look at is, if this is something that you're committed to, if you're committed to pursuing this path of dedicating and devoting yourself to taking these auditions and the kind of work and the kind of, real commitment that it requires to do those auditions, looking at ways to define commitment and define your approach to those auditions in a way that works for you. So, lots of times we are raised with this or taught, it's like it needs to be X number of hours in the practice room, or you need to, like there's that whole awful thing that musicians are said that every hour that you're not in the practice room, somebody else is. And I want to offer that there's a lot of really creative and interesting ways to prepare to represent yourself really beautifully and impeccably as an artist that don't require as much time in the practice room as many of us kind of grew up being taught. And I think that the dedication and devotion and hours in the practice room is a really valuable concept at earlier stages in our career, where we do need to put in the hours, and we do need to put in the time, and we do need that repetition. And there is no substitute for that. And as we get older and more experienced and we have life experience, we become more seasoned artists. We are clearer in our own thinking. We have a stronger concept about our own interpretation and what we want to say. A lot more can be done with visualization, with mental practice, with practicing smart, with finding little nooks and crannies in your day where you can get a lot of powerful work done that doesn't require those big blocks of time that we used to do for example, in music school when we were studying in that way. In fact, my flute teacher in music school was a huge proponent of less is more as far as practicing, that the time commitment is less important than how intelligently you approach your work. And I think that applies outside of music as well. There's a sense that busyness and just being and working all the time equals productivity. And I think that that's so often not the case. So I don't know if this is exactly what you're looking for in terms of helpfulness, but I think that a lot of what can serve us when we're faced with some real realities about what's required financially to be able to do the basic necessities of being a human, trying to find ways to be artists in that context involves asking us to have a higher level of creativity and trust in our own ability to do what we need to do as artists without those giant chunks of time that, are kind of a luxury, but not a necessity.
Awesome. Great answer. Bryce, I hope that helps. Actually, can I ask you a question on what you just said about creativity? I'll just point blank ask, do you think being an orchestral musician is a creative job?
Can we go back to the candy corn question? No. Yes, I do. I absolutely do. And I think, I used to teach the orchestral rep class at New England Conservatory. And one of the things I used to talk about with the students in that class was, there sometimes can be this feeling that, there are so many limits with this music. You have to play, somebody else picks the tempo, and you got to play, you got to balance this, and this has to fit into that. And you're just like a small piece of a larger puzzle. And again, it's that idea of how do we relate to that, right? It's not that is the issue necessarily. It's how do we relate to that? So if you relate to that as a burden, or as something that stifles creativity, or something that prohibits you from being able to express yourself, then that's going to be your experience of it. And for me, the example that I love to use are Shakespeare sonnets. And if you think about a Shakespearean sonnet, and they follow this very strict form, right? And it's like this number of lines, this rhymes with this number of syllables, and that's just what it is. And when you are tasked with having to express yourself within those constraints, it actually drives a much higher level of creativity than if you can just say whatever you wanted to say in however many words it takes. So I often, when a conductor is asking for something that feels like wildly uncomfortable, or when I'm trying to fit into some kind of a context that is not my chosen, whatever it is, tempo or whatever, for me, the creativity comes in how do I create something within that? Like, what can I make happen here? How can I access like a different color palette or a different something than I would have normally done because I'm limited in this way. So that's my approach to it. I also do want to say that I sit in a very privileged position. I'm the principal flutist in the Boston Symphony Orchestra. My role has more freedom and more opportunity for individual expression than a section violinist does. And so people do have different experiences based on where they are in the orchestra. And even in the context of that, I do think that it is an extremely creative job when we choose to relate to it that way.
That's a great answer. I was going to, somebody in the chat asked me, what do I think about this? And I'm more interested in what Elizabeth thinks, but I'll just tell you that I think your big chance to be creative as an orchestral musician is in the practice room too, because that's where you get to turn your music inside out and really problem solve. And in terms of audition circuit, if you're trying to get a job, there is a slightly narrower window of creativity as far as what you can do on the stage, because you're really trying to show you can execute. And the creativity comes from the keyword and the image that you have in your head and the way that you solve those problems. But Elizabeth, you said something great about how you show up for the challenge. And it reminded me of a quote that I feel like I should print over the wall of my own office and my kitchen and my dining room that says, "You are responsible for the energy you bring into this room." And that is so important. And I'm not great at it. Ask my kids or my wife. But like it's tough to remember that you are bringing your energy to the circumstance as well as everything that's around you. And that's a huge part of your experience and certainly other people's experience too. One more question from the chat. Sherry's saying that she sees a lot of young musicians. I know she works with a lot of younger musicians that are miserable pursuing the audition circuit, looking for a dream job, any dream job. And I have to wonder that if that audition finally is going to cure the misery that so many are on. What do you think about that? That's a really good question, Sherry.
That's a great question. And in my experience, it requires work and effort to be happy and to be satisfied in a job, right? In any job. And so there is no job that is going to swoop in and kind of magically make you happy and magically make you satisfied. And again, I think this is true in the classical music world, and it's true outside the classical music world as well. And so what I believe in so firmly is that the earlier we can begin to learn how to give ourselves what we need to be happy, to be satisfied, to be fulfilled, to find our own sense of value and purpose that we can create ourselves in the way we approach our work, whatever that work might be, in the way that we create relationships in our lives, all of that, then the job is there or it's not there. It in and of itself is not the solution to anything. I want to be clear, having a strong financial situation is a huge privilege, and there's a significant impact in that. But this idea that like the job is going to complete me, it's going to fulfill me in this sort of way, if you don't have the skills and you're not actively working and learning how to create that for yourself before you get into one of these jobs, the chances are you're still going to struggle, and you're still going to need to figure that out in the context of that job as well. And so I'm a huge believer in people starting to look at this and starting to acknowledge that this is their own opportunity to figure out what makes them happy, figure out what makes them satisfied and fulfilled within the circumstances that they are currently in, and then utilizing that when they and if they find themselves in one of these quote unquote dream jobs that they're sort of driving towards.
It reminded me of another quote, which was, "Before you can realize your dream, you must first wake up," which kind of dealt with, you got to deal with whatever's happening inside of you before some external thing like a job or getting a puppy is going to change your level of misery. Although that can definitely help, Some more just quick comments here. Former principal trumpet of the Boston Symphony, Charles Schluter, says, "Congratulations on your career. Only played 2 years with you, but it was a pleasure." So that's a nice shout out from Charlie. Laura is saying, "Thanks. This is great insight here." Eric Forrester says, let me just add this here real quick and then we'll move on. "Great to see you after so many years. I'm now coaching in career number 3. You have and will make significant differences." I love that comment, because career number 3, that takes some bravery to make that many changes and change those labels that we were talking about. especially as you get out of school and to whatever age you think is too old to be changing. Let's talk about something that I have to ask you about, or I'll be filleted by my podcast audience. Elizabeth, we talk a lot about auditions and scarcity mindset and how, what's it like to get the big dream job and to finally have the financial security. And it's like a dream. Did this really happen? And then you hear that someone is walking away from a job like that, and they must think, how on earth could someone give it up? Of course, I'm talking about your huge news that this is your final season with the Boston Symphony and that you are moving on from such a prominent role. And I can only imagine what a significant decision this was for you. Can you share a little bit about what led to this choice? How are you feeling about it? Just kind of check in and explain why a person would make a decision like that.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. And it is a significant decision, and I feel great about it. And there's a lot of big feelings for me this year. I'm absolutely secure and sure about this being the right choice for me, because I'm moving towards something that is just deeply exciting to me and inspiring to me, which is to move full-time into my leadership and executive coaching work that I've been doing now for quite a number of years. And, I'm also at times, grieving the end of this very significant chapter in my own life, the privilege of being able to make music in the context that I can make music in. So it's a lot of big feelings, and part of what is important to me as I'm moving through this myself is to be really clear that big feelings doesn't make something wrong, and that this period of time it's an extremely rich time for me. And yeah, I think if you had asked me 10 or 15 years ago, what would you think about somebody, at my age walking away from a job like this? I wouldn't have even computed in my brain. And I really, what I want to say about this most clearly is that we use the language sort of walking away, or sometimes I say I'm stepping down. And really what I'm doing is walking towards. I have found something that is calling me in with a strength and with a level of conviction and passion that is really exciting to me, and that I can imagine doing it, well into old age, as long as my brain hangs on. So that's very exciting. And at the same time, yeah, it's a big thing to step away from, to step down from. And it's been about a 5-year process for me from when I first began to contemplate that there might be something for me outside of being principal flutist of the Boston Symphony. I went through a pretty significant event in my professional life about 5 years ago. And in the middle of that, I had a kind of light bulb moment on the street corner in Vienna, of all places, where I sort of had this thought for the first time in my entire life, which is that maybe this isn't the thing for me forever. And maybe I want to explore doing something else. And then my brain drew a huge blank, like, what else might that be? And that launched me into just an exploration driven by a lot of curiosity and just to kind of discover what else is there in the world. And it's just a beautiful privilege for me to have found something that feels deeply rewarding and feels like I'm going to be having an impact in a significant way, and just in a quieter way behind the scenes, having had an impact in a very public way for a long time.
If you want to hear more about Elizabeth's career, you can go back to episode 3 of this podcast, where we get into more of her background and the TED Talks and the Lonely Onlys and all the other things we talked about, which we won't rehash here. Go listen to that. Of course, just put Elizabeth's name into the YouTube. There's tons of great content there that outline all those experiences. But I love that you were talking about walking through into a new space. And that takes a lot of courage, and it takes a lot of clarity, and certainly a lot of unknowns. Are there things that you're wondering how they're going to piece together when you're going to be the one responsible for your structure and your daily activities now as well?
Yeah. And it's scary. I mean, I'm moving out of an extremely structured work life where I'm told where to go, what to play. The paycheck is what it is. There's a lot of stuff that is just kind of already established, and I'm moving into working for myself, setting my own hours, earning my own money in the sense of setting my rates. I'm being responsible for generating my livelihood for my income in an ongoing way, different from being in a tenured position in an orchestra. And absolutely scary. And there's this, there came a point where I've been doing both for quite some time now, and it became more and more clear to me that doing both at a really high level was not sustainable. It's something I can keep up for a few years, but was not something that I was really willing to do on an ongoing basis, trying to be at a level of excellence in both careers at the same time. And there's also this idea of, it's like in the like the circus, right? And it's like you need to like transfer from one trapeze to the next, right? And you got to like let go of the one before you can grab the other. And there's that sort of midair suspension. And I sure hope there's a net. And you get a lot of motivation to like really launch yourself towards that next one when you're getting ready to let go of the first one. And so it's been motivating for me also, having made this announcement and having really put a firm date on all of this, instead of it being kind of something I was thinking about privately in my own mind.
Fear is an excellent motivator. When you let go, you're like, I better grab onto something. I don't know if when you guys go on tour, you probably use the same touring company that LA Phil does, but we have these little orange signs that say LAP, and there's like an arrow, and the management and the tour company will position these lovely, incredibly helpful people with these signs to help musicians who are on tour in what I call the bubble. You kind of go in the bubble, and the bubble just floats you around Europe and tells you where to go and when to eat and what bus to get on and where to walk. Even in the middle of Barcelona on the Rambla, there were people positioned every few blocks with these signs so that our musicians would not wander off into a pasture or into the ocean or I don't know where. But it's like you really get into this mindset of we often will just moo like a cow, like when we're going through the airport, because I feel like I'm just a cow following along. It's a really weird feeling. And so having that bubble pop is going to be like probably a little frightening and also a little refreshing as well, I imagine. Yeah, I'm sure you can relate to what I'm talking about. Okay, I have to really quickly hit pause for a second to give some love to our sponsor of the podcast, the Yamaha Corporation of America. You guys know by now my relationship with Yamaha is pretty long-standing. These instruments have been by my side during many, many, many auditions, countless unforgettable concerts, and of course played in some of the best concert halls in the world when I'm on tour with the LA Phil. But here's the thing, my respect for Yamaha goes way beyond the impeccable quality of the instruments. It's also about their unwavering passion to music, education, and music performance. They're not really just making instruments. They're enriching lives, fostering music education, and creating those experiences that, for over 6 decades, nurture the musical community that we all work with. So they're kind of my collaborators. And when they asked me if I would be a Yamaha artist and if they could sponsor this podcast, it was the easiest yes I ever said, because I really do believe in the company. If you want to know more, discover the world of Yamaha at usa.yamaha.com. And guys, thank you again so much for sponsoring this podcast and making it happen. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Okay, let's get back to our conversation with Elizabeth Rowe. And let's see, there's one more question here I think we should bring up from Gloria. What aspects from your present job are you bringing into your coaching? Are you growing in the same overall direction, or are you doing more of a pivot when it comes to your own development? That's a great question.
Really great question. And when we talk about coaching, that can mean a lot of different things. And the kind of coaching work that I do specifically is a lot of thought partnership and a lot of very deep listening and creative asking of questions. And so the aspect that carries from the musician training and the musical life into coaching is the creativity piece, the listening piece, the staying in the moment and staying present, not thinking ahead, not thinking back, but really staying with the person that I'm in the room with in their thinking where they are right now, which is, as we all know, as performers, is the sweet spot also as a performer. Um, also a lot of my clients are very high achieving professionals in all sorts of spaces and all sorts of professions, and so being able to relate to that level of dedication, of excellence, of when it becomes unhealthy, of perfectionism, the difficulty in balancing work life, all of that, I can draw on that in my coaching work. What differs dramatically, though, is that as a performer in an orchestra, I am creating kind of a thing of beauty. It's as polished as I can get it, and then I sort of offer it to the audience as a gift, as a sort of a finished product. I mean, it's always evolving because night to night things change, of course, and we grow, but I'm presenting, my best version of Beethoven 3 that I can do for that night. Coaching is so much more focused on process. It's not about me handing over some polished, finalized anything. It's really all about in the moment partnering with someone else. So it's more related to the way we might partner with ourselves in a practice room, being curious, being observant, staying neutral, and being able to see what's actually happening without judging it. Some of those qualities really do transfer over, and some of the best qualities that we can bring, I think, also as teachers in the musical space, are connected to coaching skills as well.
Did y'all hear that? I'm not handing over a perfectly polished anything. I think that's applicable to orchestra performing, because I mean, I had a client today say that their goal in an audition was probably to be as perfect as possible. Now, I get what they were saying. Like, you don't want to miss too many notes, or if you have like a habitual intonation problem or something, that's probably not going to work out. But to strive for perfectionism, it's unattainable, and it will probably dampen the actual authenticity of what you're trying to communicate and connect anyway. Certainly in the coaching world, or like this word coaching is so loaded, just education, connection, mentorship, whatever you want to call it. You are not creating something and then giving it to someone. You're meeting them in the middle and meeting them where they're at. And I love that you just compared that to meeting yourself where you're at in the practice room. Tom Hooten, one of my other guests, said the same exact thing. He's like, how can I meet myself where my skills are right now? That's all you can ask for, because there is no beyond that. And I think if you can do that, you can approach your playing with more self-forgiveness and awareness. And that's where the growth and vulnerability might intersect. So it's a great answer.
Yeah, I think it's worth kind of slowing down around that too, because I think the way it's actually, I just wrote an email that's going to go out to my newsletter, whatever it's called, my mailing list later this week. But it's about this. It's sort of, how do we meet ourselves? When we meet ourselves, do we see friend or foe? Do we see an enemy? Are we berating ourselves? Are we kind of beating up on ourselves? Are we driving ourselves? Are we impatient with ourselves? Or do we treat ourselves like a friend? And are we encouraging and supportive? And when we come face to face with ourselves, either our behavior or our thoughts or the way we are playing that particular excerpt, if we can look at that from a stance of like friendliness and curiosity and a desire to be helpful, we can look at it a lot longer and with we have a lot more stamina, right, to do that. And we sometimes think that being hard on ourselves and beating up on ourselves and driving ourselves is the way to get ourselves to be better. And what that really means is that it's actually much more painful and harder to look honestly at ourselves, because we're so awful to ourselves in the process. So there can be this mistaken belief that the harder we are on ourselves, the more we succeed, the better we get. And that is, it is absolutely false. And it's a compelling but mistaken idea about how high achievers experience sustained excellence, and it just simply isn't that way. The way that we achieve sustained excellence is by meeting ourselves where we are with friendliness, with encouragement, with compassion, with acceptance, and then asking ourselves to grow and doing it in a way that it's much more effective and much more sustainable when we can take that approach to how we see ourselves and talk to ourselves.
I'm so glad this topic came up because it's a really challenging one to pull apart, especially depending on where you're standing. If you're a student looking at your teacher who teaches at the conservatory and you see them doing their practice and their warm-ups and they're recording themselves and they're preparing for work, the interpretation is that I must grind myself down to a nub in order to do what that person's doing. And if you're the professional, you're thinking, I'm trying to present a professional, polished as I can. I'm getting paid to do this. I need to make sure I do a great job, and I really care and honor this music and this conductor and my colleagues. Why do you think that we lose the grip on the balance point of what's a reasonable amount of striving, let's say? Because we all know people that we work with who maybe are on one side or the other. There are those that flip open their folders on Tuesday morning and don't even know what we're playing that week, I am sure, because I've seen it. And then there are those that maybe get more stressed out than they could not have to be. What's the driver for that emotion? Where does that come from?
Great question. And it's going to be an individual question for everyone on the one hand, right? So some of us are have a longer history and more context for self-acceptance and being okay with ourselves. And some of us come from a background and lived experiences that didn't offer us a lot of that. And so we're really wired in a lot of ways, right, to being fearful of how we're being perceived, about how we're being judged. And then we judge ourselves and we sort of get into that because that's been what we were taught and how we learned. And so for a lot of people, it's about getting some awareness about how we are oriented towards the world, right? Am I oriented in a way of having to prove and having to always be on guard against how I'm being perceived and how I'm being seen? Or can I work towards getting to a place where I'm a little bit more just inherently grounded and confident internally? And then that idea of where do we land on that spectrum of over sort of, feeling that we need to prove things or that we need to overwork or we need to kind of overdo it on that one hand versus the what are we playing on Tuesday, opening the folder kind of. But I mean, I think it's an individual question and there's a lot of nuance there. And I think a lot of it does come down to that, also that idea of like, where are we getting satisfaction and meaning and purpose? And it's, if we're practicing so that we don't mess up or so that other people don't think badly of us, that's a pretty kind of unfulfilling and scary place to be in a lot. If we're practicing and showing up because we are committed to making music at a certain level, or this is in integrity with ourselves, that's great. And the challenge becomes, how do I put that in the context of me as a whole person? So I might be able to say, okay, well, the highest level of integrity for me as a musician is practicing 23 and a half hours a day, because that way I'm sure that I'm doing it right. There, we've not made a real commitment to the whole rest of us in our lives, right? So I work with a lot of high level musicians where this is the real question and the real struggle is they're like, okay, I'm going to commit to being at this highest level so that I'm sure that I'm doing my job well. And then there's no space for anything else in their lives. And that's a recipe for burnout. It's a recipe for resentment. It's a recipe for all sorts of things that can go wrong. And I think it's, there's not a formula that you can sort of give to somebody and say, this is the right amount to practice. This is the right level to strive for. This is what coasting is versus growth. How do we, like, those are labels, those are judgments in certain cases. And so it's a nuanced, individualized process that I think if you're struggling with that, that's a sign that you're actually engaging with that question. And the real trouble comes when people aren't even asking themselves that question of like, what does this look like in the context of my life? So when you're at the point of struggling with it, you're already in a great place of starting to just question and challenge, how does music or my profession or my dedication or my commitment, like, how does that fit into the larger context of my life?
You've got one of the best places to run in the whole country along the Charles River there. And I always think of this idea of pacing and how much work I'm doing for my job as to marathon training. And the best books that I have about running injury-free talk about it's okay to walk sometimes. It's even okay to sit down on the curb and have a Gatorade. You don't always have to be precisely on your target pace, even if you're really going for a particular outcome. I mean, the outcome is to cross the finish line feeling good, not injured, and not ending up on all fours on the side of the road tossing your cookies. Like you always see people at a marathon. People are that way on the audition circuit, and certainly in the music industry, is they explode, or they're really unhappy people. And I think that learning how to pace and saying it's okay to coast for a while, obviously you've got to be honest about that and know if you're coasting so much that you're not getting the job done, because then that's not fulfilling either. This is why even though I love golf psychology, I'm a terrible golfer, and I don't really love golfing because I don't practice. I don't actually do the work. So when I get out there, the whole thing is a mismatch of my effort and expectation, and that can happen at work too.
Yeah.
Question for you: do you coach non-musicians as well, or is that something that you might be doing in the future?
Actually, at this point, most of my clients are non-musicians.
Interesting.
The majority of my clients. Yep. I have people in corporate. I have medical professionals, some scientists, people in nonprofit, arts. Not actually, I don't have any nonprofit arts organizations, but I have some nonprofit. It's the majority of my clients are not in the musical world, believe it or not. Yep.
What's the most sort of out of the blue client that you've worked with in terms of, wow, am I qualified to tell you what to do here or help you develop this?
Yeah, well, and so there's the great point. So what I do with my coaching work is I don't tell people what to do, and what I do is help them access their own best thinking. So that applies, and in a way, there's actually an advantage to me working with somebody who's in a field that I know literally nothing about, because what I'm doing is I'm noticing their thought patterns, their own way that they're relating to their work. I don't need to understand some like advanced polymer chemical thing that's going on that they're doing. That's the really beautiful thing about this particular kind of coaching that I do, is that it's about the brain. So there's an expression that I really love, which is that some people work with the chess board, like which chess piece you move into position, right? And I work with the chess player. So it's like what's going on between your two ears that is then driving your own decisions about where you move those chess pieces. So how you talk to yourself, how you engage in relationships with other people, like where are you coming into your workplace with curiosity, where are you approaching people with defensiveness, and being able to ask like dumb questions is an amazing thing to be able to do, because I ask the questions that don't get asked by experts, because the experts are already kind of in a space thinking that they know a certain amount, right? So the most basic questions are often the best ones. So somebody just yesterday said to me, I'm doing this because I'm really ambitious. And I said, so ambitious about what? And they were like, I don't really know. And I was like, is it money? Is it like influence? Is it a title? Like, what is it? And they're like, I don't know. So just me just saying, what do you mean by ambitious? And then we had this really fruitful, interesting conversation to help them start to like tune into that and ask themselves about that. And they were making a whole series of decisions because they were ambitious, and they actually, that wasn't clear for them what that meant. So, it's a really wonderful place to be in, to be able to support people in this way. And it doesn't require me knowing really much of anything about their work. It requires me knowing a lot about human brains and how brains tend to function.
I feel like we really can't not mention Nancy Kline, More Time to Think, because that is such a book that is, it sounds like you're really steeped in that way of thinking. And I love that methodology too, because it's, when I have a conversation with a client or a student, it changes obviously, because like you said, everyone's individual and where they're at. But if I can do 20% of the talking and let them do 80% and really listen, it sounds like such a basic thing, but how many of your teachers in your career if people who are listening actually listen to what you're saying or give you space to think for a minute. The word professor, they're professing something to you. It's not a really a collaboration or even a holding of space. I assume that book is something that you dig into pretty deeply in your coaching.
It is, and I have done so. Nancy Klein, I'm sure you've introduced her work to the people that you work with too, as well. And I still do thinking sessions for myself, for my own ability to get clear on my own thinking, and I offer them to clients also as a sort of a standalone thing. It's a very specific way of being with our own thinking that can be really beautiful. And the basic premise is that the answer is inside the mind of the person who asks the question. And that if we can give that person enough space to be with their own question and to be with their own thinking, very often they arrive at the best answer for them simply in the presence of very powerful and focused listening. And that is something that we don't experience in our daily lives. And it's a really powerful concept. It's deeply uncomfortable at times. It can be uncomfortable for people on both sides of the equation. And it's an extremely valuable experience, especially in our hectic society and culture these days, where we're bombarded with thoughts and ideas and opinions and advice, and so rare to be able to be quiet with our own thinking.
Great answer. And I'll put in the show notes a link to More Time to Think by Nancy Klein. It's a great audiobook, by the way, because her voice is just beautiful and soothing if you like audiobooks. Okay, we're going to take one more question, then I want to shift gears a little bit. Wow, I could talk to you for 3 hours, but I'll try not to keep you here that long. This is an interesting question that there's a question within a question. I need an honesty pill. How might you take the stress performance neuroses off the stage when a plethora of university and conservatory teaching practices have that trait baked into the pedagogy? So, that just also mentions, why do we have that trait of stress baked into our pedagogy?
Yeah. And I think also my question would be what does stress mean to you, right? So how are you defining stress? So one person's stress is another person's excitement. One person's like, this feels awful, this feels like too much pressure, is another person's, this feels motivating, and this is what is galvanizing for me. And so I think what's important about that question is that I think too often teachers or pedagogical practices use sort of these sort of false competitive kinds of tactics, right, to drive people to do the work, right? So it's that whole thing of, if you're not in the practice room, somebody else is, or this is my favorite student, you need to like chase them, or there's only room for 2 of you and you're not cutting it. Like, so that kind of way of motivating students, I think, is still part of some pedagogical styles, and it's not successful in the long term, right? We're not teaching people how to have sustainable ways to relate to, again, striving for excellence and pursuing their own growth. And, we are performers. There is pressure. I experience stress on my job a lot, what I would call stress. Part of what I see as my responsibility is to figure out how I can minimize that for myself so that it doesn't prevent me from doing my best work. And I think whoever's asking this question is right in the sense that as an industry, we aren't yet really thinking about how to equip all of us to manage stress, how to identify it, how to define it, how to maybe harness it or use those feelings in ways that are productive as opposed to destructive. So I think it's a big conversation that is important to have. And, the coach in me would be asking you, what do you mean by stress? And what does stress mean to you? And we would go from there.
That's a great question. Yeah, some people thrive on that excitement. Other people, it makes them nauseous before they walk on the stage. I would also maybe add to that, consider the teachers or environments that you're aligning with. You really need someone. I would ideally, it would be great if you could have someone help you align with the correct energy in a teacher and an institution that works for you. So when you're thinking about what institutions you're going to pay money to and go into debt for sometimes, hopefully you're getting the type of education and mentorship that aligns with how you perceive those factors. There are some studios in this country where it's very intense and they crank out people who win auditions, and those people thrive under that. And some people will just collapse under that pressure. So you need to align yourself with the correct relationships, I think, and speak up for yourself if it's not working. A teacher doesn't know, mentors don't know what the way you tick, and you need to be able to communicate that in a clear way. Otherwise, you can have a really long time in school or afterwards if you're suffering from the fallout of all that. So great question. Okay, stepping a little bit into a different space, I want to talk a little bit about gender equality and feminism, being an ally, especially in the music industry. And I know that you're stepping into other areas and non-music, but it's still such a huge problem. I talk about classical music's gender problem all the time. Female conductors, it's weird to see a female brass player. It's just absolutely mind-boggling to me. And then, of course, there's the equal pay and all the things that you dealt with 5 years ago in your own career. What do you envision pushing feminist advocacy forward in the music industry, and how can we understand and support better to help that happen?
That's a big question.
Sorry.
How much time do you have? No. I think in a lot of ways, we could talk a lot about pay structures and transparency, and we could talk about how auditions are run and the fact that what we describe as blind auditions aren't typically actually blind, because at some point they stop being blind, right? And we could talk about all of that. And I think the bigger piece of this that would serve the industry really well, and I see this in terms of how we relate to conductors, how we relate to women in other leadership positions in our organizations, is to acknowledge that we are all biased, all of us, and including women, right? And so that all the studies on implicit bias have taught us that there is no escaping bias, right? That we have all been raised, if we've been raised in this society and in this culture, but for those of us who have been, we have been steeped in these notions about what leadership looks like, about what a great conductor looks like, about who we're comfortable with in these kinds of roles. And we've all absorbed all of this, and it influences the way that we perceive others in our industry. And our industry is so deeply subjective. And I think a lot of us don't like to admit the degree of subjectivity that is present in our own view of what makes a great flutist, what makes a great artist, what makes a great conductor. We like to think that it's more objective than I think it actually is. So I think to really be honest about how deeply subjective all of our perspectives are in this industry, and then to own up and to acknowledge the fact that we are all biased, all of us without exception. So when you combine those two elements together, we need to be really self-aware of our own way that we're relating to these people that we welcome onto our stages, right? And that we have on the podium, or that we have in our leadership positions within the management structures of our organizations. That I think as a whole, this is not yet accepted in there's not enough awareness in our industry that each of us is participating in this, whether we want to or not, whether we like it or not. So before we can start, while we are also simultaneously advocating for structural changes and things that can just flat out make things more fair and transparent and better, we also need to really own our own individual roles and responsibilities here. So the minute I see a woman on the podium and I think to myself, I don't know, there's something about her, I go, whoop, time out, slow down. Let's acknowledge the fact that I have very little experience with women on the podium. My entire formative years as a musician have been with men on the podium, right? So I am looking at whoever that might be through that lens, and I need to know that and be aware of that within myself. And I don't like it, and I also can't pretend that it's not there. So for me, there's a high level of personal integrity that is required for all of us to be able to speak with some level of honesty about this blend of subjectivity and bias that exists in this industry. And if we could just start with that, that would be an amazing starting point to start to have better conversations around all of this and to come up with better solutions that are kind of the more bigger structural solutions that we can also be looking at.
Well, that was a brilliant answer. Thank you so much for that. I have two more quick questions for you, and they're related to what you just talked about. And that is, by the way, I put the link to Elizabeth's website in the chat on YouTube. If you jump on that website, you're going to get an offer to join her list, which I really recommend you do. And Elizabeth is going to send you a guide that she put together called The High Achiever's Guide to Moving Past Failure. And it's kind of really appropriate to what I was going to ask you now is, and this is also a very big question, but I just want to hit this past you real quick. What happens when someone doesn't get tenure? What happens when they put in the work, they do the 2 years, and because of that subjectivity, because one person's beautiful tone is another person's, this doesn't fit here, or whatever. There can be biases that are. I mean, we really try and run clean auditions and tenure processes, but like you said, we all have some baked in things that we don't even know about. How do you turn that around? How would you coach someone to sort of process that and move forward?
Really tough, really painful experience for somebody. Devastating, frankly, and especially when there hasn't been. I mean, most of our orchestras do not have put a lot of thought and intention around all of these processes, and there's not a high ethical level of communication, of clarity, and even a set of values about like what is the probation period about? Is it about evaluating someone? Is it about helping somebody become a productive member of the orchestra? What is the role of the committee? How do we have safeguards in place? There's enormous opportunity to improve this process. And so when there's an individual who has been through that process and has poured their heart and soul into doing everything within their power to navigate that successfully, and sometimes in the end, the decision is made by one person, right? It's the music director makes the decision. And I have some real serious problems with a lot of the way that this process happens in a lot of places. And for the individual who goes through this, I think so much of our work as we face setbacks in our lives and in our careers is to try to understand how much of this is outside of me and is not mine to own, right? And and is there a learning opportunity for me here? There may not be, right? But to be able to hold both, to be able to say, I can recognize the structural problems, the unfairness, the whatever might be at play, and also, is there something for me to learn here? And depending on the situation and the circumstances, sometimes there's a lot for the individual musician to learn in terms of how they want to go forward in their next opportunity. Sometimes it's that awful sensation of basically seeing something for kind of the dysfunctional process that it is, and having to acknowledge that on this particular day you were the person that got injured by that. And each situation is really unique and individual, and I think so important for all of us to be able to hold that balance of personal responsibility and then seeing that in the context of the structural problems and the structural bias and the unfairnesses that do exist out in the world.
I always quote this yoga teacher from a DVD I had many years ago who was helping us deal with falling out of tree pose, which you always do better on one side than the other. And he always says, we're all going to fall in life. Fall with awareness and acceptance. And I love those two words because you kind of need to know, is there something for me to learn here that I do need to change? And also acceptance, going back to the top of our call, that rejection does not mean a career ruined. you can move through that experience and come out the other side even more bulletproof and more aware of what it is you need to do. So it's not always the end of the road.
Yeah, and I also want to add to that that something that can be deeply healing and empowering is for people who have been through those kinds of experiences to become a force for good in their future workplaces or wherever they move through into the world. Is that when you have been through something really hard and you've been treated unfairly, or you've simply just had a devastating loss, right? A professional loss like this, or a professional setback like this, there's an opportunity to take that experience and to utilize that for good going forward. And that can mean being a voice for better processes. It could mean being able to support somebody else going through their own version of this. Like, there's lots of ways that we can use those experiences to in service of something better. And that can be empowering and really healing when you get to that place to be able to do that.
You might even become a coach like Elizabeth and create something called your tenure team that helps people navigate this exact experience. So there's always opportunity when there's a wall that you walk into. Speaking of walls we walk into, here's your last question. I've taken so much of your time, Elizabeth. I know you're crazy busy right now redefining yourself, but can you recall a distinct honesty pill moment where a hard truth or obstacle was standing in your way, and how addressing that impacted where you're standing right now?
I mean, I can think of lots of them. I'll think of a musical example that goes way back to when I was playing in the New World Symphony, and an oboe player, friend and colleague of mine in the orchestra, who to this day is one of my absolute dearest friends. She's no longer an oboe player. I think she calls herself a recovering oboe player, or recovered. And I remember I was playing for her in preparation for an audition or something like that. And she, I played my excerpts. I felt really good about it. I was feeling real strong, like feeling pretty proud of myself. And she kept saying, yeah, but she said, you cracked a lot of notes. And I said, yeah, but I'm a flute player. We crack notes. And she said, no, but you cracked a lot of notes. And I'm like, yeah, I know. But it's a flute. It's whatever. And finally she said, it bothers me. and then I was like, oh yeah, thank you very much. And I had there that was an early one, but it was like it's kind of it's a light example, and yet it was me having to actually like look with more honesty at what I was putting out there, and ask myself to not kind of let myself off the hook in that same way, right? So that was really helpful to me. Also super helpful to hear the perspective of somebody who's, again, back to me being a coach of non-musicians, where I hear and see things differently because I'm standing outside of their experience. As an oboe player, she was not buying that, like, I'm a flutist, I crack a bunch of notes kind of, thing that I was feeding her. And I will say that the other, on a much bigger level, one of the other, I think, crossroads in my own career was in the context of my equal pay lawsuit, there were a couple of moments where I was faced with, two choices. One was to kind of go forward in this direction, and one was to stop, right? And they both seemed like wildly impossible to me and deeply uncomfortable, and just terrifying. And what it ended up coming down to for me was, I had no idea what the outcome of any of this was going to be. I had no idea what the consequences of any of this was going to be. But what I became clear about was like the choice that I could live with going forward. Like, I didn't know what the outcome was going to be, or what the results or consequences were going to be, but there was a choice to and again, and I don't mean to say this, that everybody should make the same choice, but for me in that particular moment, and there was sort of a few crossroads moments where I had to make a choice that was something that I felt like was the by far more uncomfortable choice and more scary choice, and that it was the one that I could, in understand and live with myself for making that choice. And ultimately that's what has brought me to where I am now. And I'm so grateful for that. I'm so grateful for that. And for everything that was hard about that experience, I'm profoundly grateful that it has led me to this unexpected and really exciting new kind of crossroads in my own professional life. And that's another thing that, I don't like sort of having those like life lessons, like everything that's hard is hard for a reason and blah, blah, blah. And that was a deeply difficult experience that has proven to be an immense gift for me.
Well, I am profoundly grateful that you are able to spend some time and share your insights. You truly are in a very unique position in our industry of having achieved what so many are trying to achieve and then evolving through it into what's going to be, I think, a really exciting and beautiful time. I can't wait to watch and see what happens next. And guys, go ahead and do yourself a favor. Get on Elizabeth's email list, get her High Achiever's Guide to Moving Past Failure. And also check out her website. She's actually going to be walking you through her final year as principal flute of the Boston Symphony. She's going to be sharing reflections, videos, and other observations of this incredibly transformative experience. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me and for having these kinds of important conversations for everybody that is following you and in your world. They're lucky that you are committed to sort of opening minds in this way. It's beautiful.
Thank you. I appreciate it. All right, hang on for a second. I also want to say thank you all for listening. If you're enjoying this podcast, would you please consider leaving us a quick review over at Apple Podcasts? It really does help be bringing some of the guests like Elizabeth that we want to hear. Okay, everybody, that's it for me. I'm out of here. Happy practicing. We'll see you next time.